Hello everyone. Welcome to the Tokyo College event. I'm today's moderator, Arisa Emma, Associate Professor at the University of Tokyo College. Today I'm really happy to invite distinguished lecturer, Dr. Neville Bolt, to our event, and also the commentator, Professor Chiyuki AOI. First of all, I would like to introduce today's lecturer's bio. Dr. Neville Bolt is the founder and the director of the Sympodium Institute for Strategic Communications and editor-in-chief of NATO Defense Strategic Communications Academic Journal. He is visiting professor at the University of Tokyo, senior fellow at Strategic Communications Education and the Research Unit at the University of Tokyo, and visiting scholar at St. Edmund College, University of Cambridge. And for 20 years, he has reader in strategic communications and convener of the master's and doctoral programs in strategic communication in the Department of War Studies, King's College London. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford and a former journalist, television producer, specializing in conflict and war zones in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. So with him, today's webinar title is this the age of disinformation or the age of strategic communications? So the title sounds really exciting, and I'm really happy to hear what kind of talk he's gonna make. So Professor Neville Bolt, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I begin, I'd just like to offer a very quick word of thanks to President Hoshi of Tokyo College and to the Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy, Dean Kawaguchi, and also to Professor Aoi from Seru at the University of Tokyo. Without their support, I wouldn't be here today, able to enjoy the conversation, and I hope it'll be a conversation with you rather than a lecture. And I say that because I work in the field of strategic communications, and all too often the problem that emanates from political and geopolitical relationships with between government and population, or government and citizens, is that governments tend to preach and lecture when they should actually be engaged in a conversation, a multi-way conversation. And so let's hope we can have a bit of multi-way conversation today. Age of strategic communications or age of disinformation. What's the problem here? Why are we looking at two concepts? The answer is quite simply because governments have in recent years embraced both concepts with great enthusiasm, but not necessarily with great knowledge. And what I believe is already emerging is a conflation between the two concepts, a kind of blurred overlapping between the two concepts rather than a convergence, an actual segueing of two intellectual propositions so that they build on each other and mutually reinforce the value of each other. So roughly half our time will be spent with me offering up some ideas, and then the second half of our session will be you offering up ideas in response and together. And I want to divide my part of this session into, I want to look at it in three sections. One, what is strategic communications? Two, what is disinformation? And three, what's the problem? So let's begin. So we're working towards a proposition that what is desirable is convergence and not conflation. Political communications, and by that I also mean geopolitical communications, requires continuity, consistency, and credibility. And this can only be achieved by converging, at least bridging these two concepts. So let's see what these two concepts actually entail, because there's quite a lot to say about them. And there's already something of a kind of scholarly and intellectual hinterland, which we need to expose, which we need to lay out in order for everyone today to be able to build ideas and understanding on these. So what is strategic communications? Let me start with the basic assumption. Every human being communicates both strategically and tactically. So a newborn baby very soon learns how to influence a parent, whether it's through a smile or whether it's through crying, and learns to, after not too long, plan the intended outcome of their communication. They know what they're trying to achieve. So every human being communicates strategically, but not every human being is a strategic communicator. There's a difference. Because to be a strategic communicator essentially requires that you have a checklist. I'm oversimplifying this, but the points I think are still well made. A checklist that says, if you want to be a strategic communicator, you have to fulfill certain criteria. And I'll list them very quickly for you. We don't have to go into them. I'll just take you through. 1, your role is to, and your aim is to shift and shape discourses in and across societies. 2, you're focused on long-term change in people's attitudes and ultimately their behavior. 3, you target or you identify specific audiences in order to achieve specific strategic effects or outcomes. 4, when you communicate, you're competing in a highly contested, dynamic media environment. It's a very noisy space, and you have no right to be heard or seen. And 5, you're communicating through images, words, and actions and inactions. And number 6, the key to all this is that strategic communications is rooted in a liberal, democratic system of values. And these are the fundamental freedoms of the individual. And sitting right at the heart of these fundamental freedoms of the individual are free speech and individual choice. So let's just review quickly where strategic communications came from. So you will find that, and it's quite right that you should, expect to see competing understandings of what strategic communications is all about. And I'm going to give you mine, and hence I try to frame my thinking around strategic communications as a Western, liberal, democratic construct, a universal system of values that emerged in the early 21st century. Let me just take you through a very brief trajectory. You can actually find people talking about strategic communications back in the early 1960s, particularly the American military. But what they're talking about is not what we're talking about. They're referring to, if you like, cables, engineering systems that connect military decision makers around the world. This is not what we're talking about. But the term itself, just so you're not confused, the term itself was already present in the early 1960s. Throughout the 70s and 80s, it was also emergent in the world of business, in the corporate sector. But there it meant something different again. It didn't mean what the 1960s military people thought. It meant something altogether different. It meant, how does a business corporation communicate effectively in order to transmit the will of the senior management down to the workforce, but also how should it communicate its ideas, its values as a commercial or corporate brand externally. But then in the 1990s, something happened. The United Nations, following the fall of the Soviet Empire, was presented with an opportunity to respond to certain crises. And those in particular were Bosnia, Rwanda, and Somalia. And the United Nations did not perform well. In fact, it performed extremely badly. Under its then leadership under Boutros-Boutros-Ghali. In 1997, his successor, Kofi Annan, ordered a review of United Nations communications internally. And he wanted to know, how was it possible that an organization with such great values and such high moral standing had so little respect around the world? And the report that came back said, well, one, the organization itself was not fit to communicate internally. And two, it needed to no longer preach from a very high mountain down to people, but it had to actually engage people in their own languages. And by that, the report meant speak to people directly in the way they want to be spoken to, and participate in a multi-way conversation. In the 2000s, 9/11 shifted strategic communications, if you like, onto the level of grand strategy, geopolitics and grand strategy. And in particular, as it became apparent that the world was returning to a fondness for great power politics, by 2008, which is when Russia invaded the state of Georgia, the former Soviet state of Georgia, and occupied 2 of its provinces with its military, then NATO, the world's biggest political military alliance, began to use the term strategic communications. I would argue they didn't really know what they meant by that, but it sounded good, it sounded important, it sounded the right kind of level of response to what, even then, NATO didn't really want to recognize as a reassertion of Russian militarism, but it was aware that something was happening. By 2014, the invasion of Crimea, Ukraine, by Russia, certainly then put NATO very much on course to trying to engage with a more sophisticated form of geopolitical communications. And that continued through to the early 2020s, when Russia once again invaded with great force eastern Ukraine. back in 2014, so soon after the invasion of Crimea, NATO opened a center of excellence for strategic communications in the Baltics, headquartered in Riga in Latvia. And less than 10 years later, 2023, last year, it finally two written pieces. One was doctrine, and the other was a terminological project in trying to explain, trying to understand what strategic communications was. And those two documents, the key documents, one was NATO Doctrine AJP-10, which came from the military side of NATO, and Terminology Report number 3, which came from the civilian side, and both met in the center, and in the end, both reasserted the claim that strategic communications had to be anchored in fundamental freedoms, which were to be found originally in NATO's founding treaty, the Washington Treaty of 1949, which bridged directly into the UN Charter 1945, Article 51, and which in turn echoed Franklin Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Nation speech when he talked about 4 freedoms. So there's a very brief trajectory of something which, as you can see, is still emergent. Certainly from an academic point of view, it's still emergent. It requires a great investment in trying to theorize and conceptualize it, even though it's fair to say that policymakers and media practitioners are already running away with the term, and they feel they're doing strategic communications. I suppose what academics would argue is, yes, they are sometimes, but most of the time, they don't have a very clear idea of what strategic communications is, and they can't have that because the theory and the conceptual basis of strategic communications is still too thin and requires a lot more work in order to shore up, to create very robust foundations, theoretical foundations, for what in the end is the practice of politics and geopolitics. So that just gives you a very quick chronology. I think we should also ask, why does it emerge in the early 21st century? Why now is the question. I think there are various factors, and sometimes they're mutually compounding, and sometimes they kind of follow their own route. The failure of Western invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq in the post 9/11 era, the failure of kinetic activity, of the use of force, reminded people that there was the other dimension to trying to influence people and change the way they think, or at least the way their society might function, and that was persuasion. Not everything, in fact, one would hope, very few things in life require the use of hard force. The Islamic fundamentalist insurgency, which had been, and we don't want to go into the complexities of it, but it's apparent in the 1980s, 1990s, and emerges and moves on to Western soil, of course, with 9/11. And it generates a new approach to military activity, to fighting back against Islamic fundamentalist insurgency through persuasive and coercive counterinsurgency. And by that, I mean counterinsurgency as a convergence of two concepts. One, counterterrorism, which is the use of force, and aid and development, which essentially is the use of attraction and persuasion. Then I would argue, why now in the 21st century? The return of great power politics. Today, we tend to focus less on sub-state or trans-state insurgencies. Now, the conversation is very much about the United States, Russia, China, big powers, great powers, who are now projecting their will onto the global stage. And specifically, particularly, and very brutally in the last couple of years, we've seen the projection of Russian irredentism, this claim to want to win back what Russia believes to be Russian soil and not Ukrainian soil. At the same time, as China is asserting its own hegemonic ambitions in Asia-Pacific, and who knows, maybe those are hegemonic ambitions that may be global, we don't know. At the same time, the revolution in information and digital communications technologies has increased the flow of information around the world, and certainly has increased the number of conversations that are out there in the virtual space, on the internet, on mobile phones. And they also have that volume of communication has tended to weaken the authority of governments, of nation states, who believe that formerly they had a monopoly on political communications. And then I'd make a broader point. Why now in the 21st century? Because there's a perception that from the period of heightened success in the 1980s, when more and more countries were turning democratic, we find ourselves we're a quarter of the way already. We're about to move into the second quarter of the 21st century. And democracy, at least there's a perception that democracy is in retreat, that autocracy, and indeed even totalitarianism, are advancing. So that would, I'd suggest that the interaction, the interplay between some of these mutually reinforcing factors in different ways at different times in this time period suggest why strategic communications as a Western, liberal, democratic construct has actually arrived on the scene. And I want to bring out 2 points there. One is the assertion of liberal thinking, universal liberalism, founded on the fundamental freedoms of the individual, but also the concept of Westernness, that this is a Western construct, a Western democratic construct, where I believe that the West is attempting to re-energize itself internally, but also refresh its discursive offering to the rest of the world. For those academics who are tuned in, and this is maybe not the most exciting thing for most people, I would suggest there are 4 ways of maybe looking at strategic communications. Sounds a bit academic, but the principles are fairly straightforward. One way is to think of strategic communications through a functionalist lens. What does that mean? It means, where does strategic communications fit into your organization? Now, before strategic communications came along, which is only, what, 15 years ago? Maybe it's 20 years ago. Who knows? Clearly, organizations, whether governments, civil society organizations or businesses communicated. They've always communicated. So they already had staffs, departments, budgets responsible for communicating. So when suddenly your boss says, we're now going to introduce strategic communications, somebody's got to work out not only what it is, but how does it fit into your institution, into your organization. So that's one lens I think that's worth looking at. Another lens, which is an instrumentalist lens, which is another way of saying, how can you use it? I would argue that most media agencies who work for governments or for even civil society NGOs, or even, I suppose, for those companies, particularly transnational companies, that see themselves engaged not just in making money, but also in actively engaging in other societies' governmental activities. So I'm thinking about big data, big pharma, big oil, what else is there? Big tech, the bigs. The agencies who work for those are in the business of being paid to deliver results, being paid to deliver effective communications, meaning do they achieve the objectives they set out, that they promise at the outset. Whether they're vested in absolutely in liberal democratic thinking, I think is not their priority. Their priority is do a good job for your customer. And I think that's an instrumentalist way of looking at strategic communications. Then I think there's a third way, which is, I call it essentialist. And I think it's a fairly obvious one, because I think the essentialist lens says, okay, you told me there's a way of looking at how does it fit into an organization. Another way of looking at it is, how do you do it? How do you use it? What about, before we even start on that, what is it? What is it that makes strategic communications tick? What is the beating heart? Where is the soul of strategic communications? And that's what I've been trying to just at least suggest to you in the last few minutes. And then there's a fourth. And I think this is an interesting one for me. It's an interesting one. And I'd call this normative, a normative lens. And what do I mean by that? I mean, what would you like it to be? Not what do you think strategic communications is, or how can you use it, but what would you like it to be? Now, if you're an academic, you're going to say, wait, stop, just wait a minute. You've now crossed the line. The first three things I can accept: instrumentalism, functionalism, and essentialism, because you could argue they're objectively evaluated and defined. But once you cross the line and start to say what you'd like it to be, you've transitioned from an objective assessment to a subjective assessment. But because I think that strategic communications is a constructive project and a constructivist project, it is about creating big conversations, discourses, which have a value-driven ambition, then personally, I don't have a problem with that, but maybe that makes me a bad academic. What do I mean by those? Well, I don't mean attaching strategic communications to war and conflict. And I'd say that because so far in the last 15 or 20 years, it has very much been hijacked by the security agenda. Where I would like to see the conversations happen, where I'd like to see big discourses shift public opinion around the world, would be in trying to right the wrongs of the record mass migration that we're witnessing around the world in the early 21st century. I'd like to find a more equitable way that nation states can break out of their national interest and cooperate, but also cooperate with big pharma corporations when trying to even out the inconsistencies of delivering support, biomedical support for victims of pandemics, given that we know sooner or later the world will be hit again by a pandemic crisis. I'd like to position strategic communications in the area of climate change, which is a very complex aggregation of different ideas and different problems, and they all sit under climate change or global warming. But that doesn't need, and I don't think should necessarily be conceived of as some kind of conflict. I think it should be conceived as economic cooperation as well as a way of binding the populations of nation states to a common interest, since we do and will continue to suffer from the same extreme conditions. And in turn, I think strategic communications should be engaging firmly with conversations around a new green economy, if that is the answer to the next phase of capitalist development after, however you want to calculate it, whether it's 200 years, 300 years, or even 500 years of capitalism. But if that is to be the next stage of capitalism, then how do we have conversations about it? Okay. Part two, I want to get on to disinformation. And once I talk about disinformation, I'm going to introduce another concept in a minute, which is carries the horrible acronym of FEMI. But basically, it's about foreign malign influence. But let's start with disinformation and try to understand what we're talking about here. So I'm arguing that there are two big concepts that governments are really attracted to. One, strategic communications. They don't really know what it is, but they want it. And two, disinformation. I think they have a better idea of what disinformation is. And they want counter-disinformation. So when did disinformation really appear as a talking point? I think it, first of all, comes from two different directions. One, it starts to arrive following the, and I mentioned them before, the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, but particularly the invasion of Ukraine 2014. And the reason that we tend to attach disinformation to those events, particularly Ukraine, is because the ground was prepared very clearly in terms of conversations that came out of Moscow around an understanding of Ukraine. So Moscow's account was, and is still, nothing's changed, that the Ukraine is not a sovereign state. There is no Ukrainian nation. And further than that, they introduced stories into the global media space, two particular stories. One, that Ukrainians were Nazis, and two, that Ukrainians were all homosexuals. But separate from that, we started to see particularly around 10 years ago, systematic campaigns organized around flooding the media space, not just with one or two lies, but with around the same single event, multiple accounts. The idea being that not to create a single truth, but to create 20, 30, 40, 50 truths around the same event, different accounts of what had happened and why something had happened. This was not to invite rebuttal, but the intention was to flood the global media space with so many accounts that they would create confusion, uncertainty, and undermine any concept of evidence-based truth-telling. So let me remind you what disinformation is. Disinformation is the deliberate manufacture of false information aimed at a community or society with the objective of creating uncertainty in order to destabilize, undermine the political status quo. Now, when that manufactured, let's call them what they are, lies, when manufactured lies are transmitted within the population from one unsuspecting person to another, then we call that misinformation. But disinformation is the deliberate and knowing act of manufacturing false information for the purposes of subversion. So coming out of Russia, we had these two, and they overlapped, two major thrusts. One was aimed at Ukraine, preparing the ground for seizing Ukraine and taking it back into the Russian fold. And the other was a much more general approach. And sometimes one suspects it was strategic. And a lot of the time it was purely opportunistic, seeing that Western democracies were, I don't want to use the word crisis really, but they were in a state of self-examination. Some would argue they were fragmenting within the democratic populace, even polarizing. And that if you could insert multiple accounts of the truth, then you could not only reinforce the different attitudes and points of view, but you could actually create greater uncertainty and thereby weaken any state. But I don't think we should lay all this at the door of Russia, because also around 10 years ago, and I think it's very appropriate that we should be having this conversation, what is it, 3 months, 4 months before the United States presidential election. (2015, 14, 15, and going into the 2016 presidency, then the man who became president of the United States, Donald Trump, certainly was not averse to using what his representatives called alternative facts. And this period became known as a kind of era of post-truth. And you'll all remember this horrible phrase that Donald Trump used repeatedly, which was fake news. So it wasn't as if this was just coming from Moscow, it was coming out of Washington, and it was being broadly disseminated. So why did disinformation appear? I think there are different reasons for it. again, as with strategic communications, there are different developments which mutually reinforce one another sometimes. One, the development of Western continental European philosophy after the 1960s, which argued that there was more than one truth. There was no single truth, which for a lot of ordinary people didn't really make sense. But for those who were particularly politically minded and active or activist, allowed them to draw on the claim of moral equivalence. There were many truths and all truths had equal value. Something else I think was happening more recently than that, which was after the fall of the Soviet Union, throughout the 1990s and the early part of this century, and including today, we lack a metaphor, and a metaphor just, which is, as you know, a condensed, concise, simple way of understanding something which is complex. We have no metaphor that captures threat and securitization in the world following 1990. We're struggling to understand, after the Cold War, what comes after the Cold War. At the same time, I mentioned it earlier, the polarization and fragmentation of Western democratic politics, which is related to the undermining of the certainty of a single truth, and even the undermining of evidence-based truth-telling, because of this, an overarching belief that everybody's opinion under moral equivalence was of equal value. We can't rule out the internet and social media platforms, which have been highly influential, disseminating multiple claims to be heard. So, if those give you an insight into why disinformation started to take a hold, I think I should point out that disinformation as such, the idea that how do we return to an understanding of evidence-based truth-telling as a way of trying to understand the world around us. But it's important to point out that if disinformation was the big topic 10 years ago, it already transitioned after 2 or 3 years into something called the acronym FEMI, which is basically, the concept is foreign malign influence. It's very simple. But what it's trying to say is that it is not just about truth-telling. It is about foreign malign actors who seek to subvert other states by using any means possible that are at the command of the state, of the communicating state. In that sense, you might say that disinformation was monodimensional. It was talking about truth. And FEMI is multidimensional, albeit while trying to draw on all the assets of a state to attack another state, it is probably still part of a single concerted program. In the late teens, so less than 10 years ago, the atmosphere around the ambitions of China I suppose were revised. There was a shift certainly in Western states, in terms of trying to understand, initially through the Belt and Road Initiative, but later through maritime aggressions in the South China Sea, for example, on the part of China, but also the Chinese use of surveillance of its own Chinese diasporic communities around the world, but as well as the use of economic means as ways of pressuring states into doing something they didn't necessarily want to do. EMA draws its spirit from this multi-agency approach, which in years or decades or even centuries gone by, we would probably have called statecraft. The problem is we don't have a metaphor. We can't understand what we're looking at because it's like a hydra. It just seems to keep growing more and more and more dimensions. Are we looking at an organism? Are we looking at an ecology? Are we looking at a system? What is it that China is offering that takes it way beyond what Russia was doing with its disinformation campaigns as a form of subversion, or even, many would argue, what individuals in the West, such as Donald Trump, but he wasn't the only one, and isn't the only one, what they were doing in terms of distorting understandings of political truth in order to achieve their ends. So, let me just move to part 3. I'm going to take a few more minutes than I'd originally anticipated. What are we saying here? We're saying that there's been a seismic shift in the context of geopolitics, to what many people like to call polycrisis. And I think it's worth going back 100 years to the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci, and just quoting from him. His quote, not my quote. And he wrote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." And perhaps that's what we're looking at. Perhaps that best captures what's happening today in what appears to be a shift to multipolarity in geopolitics, to multi-alignment in geopolitics, and to multi-dimensionality in the very means which particularly states use, whether it's land, sea, air, space, cyber. Maybe this is what's causing so much uncertainty and confusion. It seems that the ground on which we stand seems to be constantly shifting. It's as if we're standing on a permanent earthquake. So let's just try to summarize some of these points and bring them together. I like to think that the best way to understand or to penetrate strategic communications is through what I call ways of seeing. You could call it perspectives, you could call it a mindset. But first, I think that a lot of the points that I've tried to lay out for you today, they capture the struggle in liberal democracy. And the problem is that democracy's strength is at the same time its weakness, its openness, its plurality, which are primary and fundamental, are actually also its vulnerabilities. So the question in my mind is always, are we living through an era in democratic participation where the glass is half full, meaning democracies around the world are re-examining what it means to be democratic, what it means to be able to participate, what it means for governance models to be transparent, accountable, and open to the individual being able to accede to positions and tools of power. That's an optimistic way of putting it. That's the glass half full. But what about the glass half empty? So if we listen to illiberal Democrats, if we listen to autocrats in Moscow, Beijing, in North Korea, in Iran, they tell us that democracy has had its day. It is not fit for purpose. It is not able to guarantee its citizens continuity, consistency, the economic certitude and security over the future. Is that the case? Is it the glass is half empty rather than half full? Is it a pessimistic view of democracy? Well, each of you will have your own view of that. I take the optimistic view that democracies are currently working their way through, with great difficulty, attempting to re-examine their conscience almost, but try to evolve a new and more culturally particular and responsive approach to democratic participation, which will vary from country to country, but it's a process of re-energizing a model that is barely 100 years old, but nevertheless that requires the next step in democratic progress. So that's one thought. And I think that's a central thought when one's considering strategic communications. But there's something also, when I look at strategic communications alongside counter-disinformation or foreign malign influence, and that is the relationship between short-termism and long-termism. This counter-disinformation appears tactical, operational, short-term, often driven by an emergency or a crisis mentality. Strategic communications defines itself as a long-term project. If it isn't a long-term project, it's out of business. It has no purpose. But when you put the two side by side, and if there is no coherence between the two concepts, then you run the risk that particularly with states, in trying to mitigate the effects of disinformation, that they run the risk of over-responding, overreacting, overextending their democratic remit, their moral remit, and subverting from within, by their own hand, their own long-term projects. So short-termism versus long-termism, I think, is a problem. I think it's particularly a problem today. We're living through a period of transactional politics and geopolitics. We're told that the big men, great power leaders, can strike deals between each other very effectively. But this is deal-making, but I don't hear any talk of long-term vision-making, mission-building, or the attempt to create new norms. In essence, what we're saying is that disinformation requiring counter-disinformation, that counter-disinformation or counter-BME ultimately see life through a crisis lens. They are reactive. Counter disinformation is reactive. Strategic communications is preemptive. But central to strategic communications is the concept, the relationship between continuity, coherence, and consistency. How not to undermine continuity, coherence, and consistency when, and thereby credibility, by over-focusing on the immediate, on today's problem. This is the key to long-term politics. I say this because, in a sense, as futile as it is to respond to disinformation, incidents of disinformation, because they are so easy to create, so easy to project, so easy to disseminate, that it becomes a thankless task. It's a task without end. And it begs the question, what is the end game for counter disinformation? What do you want to achieve? Is it that you want to persuade somehow in your counter disinformation policy, Moscow and Beijing, if you look at it that way? Do you want them to cease and desist? Because the answer is they're not going to. Just because you ask them to, and because you invest a lot of money running around identifying specific incidents and establishing the fact that they're not true. There's no evidence. What is the end game? What do you want to achieve? But what makes counter disinformation so attractive to governments is that it's evidential. You can actually trace particular incidents of untruth telling that have been injected, disseminated into your population. You can trace them. You can attribute them to their source. And for politicians, this is very attractive. Because it becomes evidential in its own right. It proves that governments and their civil servants are actually doing something rather than just talking about great, noble visions. They're actually identifying enemy actions, they're able to trace them to their source, and they're able to count them. And what that means is it allows any government minister to be able to say to the electorate, to the voters, and to the taxpayers, we invested this amount of money and look what we found. This is what we did for the money. It's very difficult to say to voters and taxpayers, we've spent a lot of money trying to build a new vision of a better society. Because in the end, the best you can do is lay out policies, and we know that policies take years, if not decades, to feed through. So on that note, I'm going to conclude and just remind you that what I'm arguing for is convergence, intellectual convergence, where you find a way of connecting the long term to the short term to create, let's hope, a seamless coherence and continuity and consistency in order to create credibility in the minds of the electorate, and not to sink into a muddled and muddied conflation. And this is my fear, that increasingly governments are opting for the short-termism and what they would perceive as the empirical, evidential route of counter-disinformation, and at the same time, in a historic period of transactional politics and geopolitics, failing to look at the big questions that face humanity and how we're all, I would hope, setting about together to address those big questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bolt. That was really interesting discussion as for from my perspective, because I'm doing research on like the AI and the society issues, and the AI artificial intelligence is definitely kind of connected to the discussion of disinformation, misinformation. About having heard of what you have been looking from this kind of geopolitical dimension, it really have kind of broadened my eyes of kind of understanding how to deal with this new society, new era, and also to deal with the new technology. So this is really important and exciting topic. Thank you very much. So from now on, I would like to ask Professor Chiyuki Aoi, our commentators of this presentation for this lecture. So just before moving into your comments, I just wanted to briefly introduce your bio. So Dr. Chiyuki Aoi is Director of Strategic Communication Education and Research Unit and the Professor of International Security at the Graduate School of Public Policy, the University of Tokyo. She also serves as a member of the editorial board of Defense Strategic Communications, the official journal of NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence. From 2008 to 2009, she was visiting researcher fellow at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, and from 2019 to 2020, visiting professor there. In August 2018, she was elected as a member of the Council of Security and Defense Capabilities by the Shinzo Abe cabinet. So the Professor Chiyuki Aoi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I thank Tokyo College for extending invitation to me to comment and rather ask a couple of questions to distinguished scholar on strategic communications, Dr. Neville Bolt. Thank you, Dr. Bolt, for your very elaborate explanation of what strategic communications is, what disinformation and FIMI or countering malign foreign influence is, and also how do you avoid and characterizing the relationship between the two as conflation rather than conversion. And finally, I think that you did a extremely logical, it presented a logical line of thinking about how to combine them without getting muddled in them in two different concepts, and to somehow align your discussion to ongoing political situation globally and also inside in particular United States, where important elections are being held. I would like to actually keep my comment part very, very short and jump directly to questions. I would like to ask you actually two questions. First is, I really appreciated the importance of your argument in that you presented as normative definition of strategic communications, and that's novel, and also that's very important. So your appreciation of strategic communications, that it's a normative project where it is understood to be the long-term shaping and shifting of dominant discourses in societies, so that the results achieved is a positive change, and positive change is defined in terms of fundamental freedoms of individuals, Western liberal norms. That's very important. And I think additionally, you identify the characterize and stress the proactive and even preemptive role of strategic communications. And it's a shaping activity, it's a creative activity, resulting in some sort of a construction. And I think from that perspective, it sounds so abstract, but I would like to maybe alert to the audiences here, very informed audiences here, that perhaps we have had in the past such examples, because I think strategic communications is very aligned to the notion of liberal international order or rules-based order, however you call it, rule of law-based order. And all these are something that we created in the post-war era, yes, and then try to maintain it in the current era when Cold War is over, post-Soviet Union and all that. And in the post-truth era, we are trying to maintain the relevance of rules-based order. And I think Japanese government's policy, key foreign policy of free and open Indo-Pacific actually is a project that's precisely belonging to this. And I would like to argue that it is a good example of strategic communications in play. Having argued all that, my first question is the following. I wonder, in your view, I think personally, I'm very much convinced that strategic communications is best defined as a normative project. But having you also identified that it's rather new as a project, as in the way you define it, probably goes back to maybe the UN report published in 1997, around that time. So it's emerged in early 21st century. So was there, in your view, however, strategic communications before the strategic communications that you talk about? Was there historically similar incidents that might have occurred? Maybe if the definition of strategic communications, as you explain it, might be strategic communications with capital S and capital C. Maybe there were some instances with small letter C and small letters. Small letter S and small letter C, because there have been a great number of, I think, political construction, political drive, political projects that created the liberal world order to begin with. That's my first question. My second question actually follows your very elaborate definition and characterization of disinformation, counter-disinformation, foreign malign influences, or FIMI, and countering FIMI. I think I agree with you that those are essentially belonging to, general category of actions that people sometimes engage in, which is subversion. So I think the effect of that is very much as people feared for, which is the creation of a rather non-linear information environment, a media environment that stays out there that might challenge your understanding of what is truth. And is it possible even to communicate truth, right? I mean, so it's a rather non-linear environment. So I think that against that background, what the policymakers are now trying to argue, what the whole purpose for those people who focus on counter-disinformation or counter-FIMI might be, to my view, this is only my view, is their efforts are sort of clustering around the idea of autonomy of their decision-making. So they want to make their own decision-making against the foreign interferences. We want to keep a, electoral debate environment very neutral, very autonomous, so that no foreigners can meddle. Yes. So I think the main key idea that might arise out of all this effort might be summarized as the achievement for strategic autonomy. And that idea is actually conjoined by many of the middle powers' interest in European or, ASEAN or even Japan's interest in ensuring strategic autonomy from G2 politics, US, China, increasingly short-termist, increasingly reaction to each other, tit for tat, policies regarding trade tariffs and so on. So we are asking for legitimately, maybe strategic autonomy from short-termist G2 politics. So whether right or not, my sort of way of understanding it is strategic autonomy actually is a emerging kind of value that might arise out of all interest in counter-disinformation and counter-FIMI. I mean, whether right or not, my worry is that sometimes strategic autonomy actually creates the plurality of values that we argue in the information domain. How strategic autonomy relates to the liberal idea of trying to ensure, democracy, the Western liberal democratic values, the distinction is not explored for those people who argue for strategic autonomy. It's their fault, probably. They need to think further why they need autonomy for. But I wonder what your take on those things, on my own observation here. I think value plurality is something that strategic communications, as you define it, is a kind of outside concept, yeah? I mean, value plurality is something that stays also within Western tradition, as you say, within the tradition of post-structuralist philosophy, etc. But then how do you marry your, strategic communications project with those emerging trends towards strategic autonomy and value plurality? So that is my question. Second question.
What you heard is my view. It doesn't follow that other people think it, but this is what I've been in one form or another dealing with strategic communications for the last 25 years. And even when people don't say what they think it is, and that's because a lot of people just don't want to do the thinking. To them, it's just not interesting. As far as they're concerned, you know what strategic communications is when you see it. It's like, what is art? Well, I know art when I see it. Well, I can't buy into that. I think you've actually got to do the intellectual heavy lifting. And it's difficult. It hurts your brain. I see strategic communications because it's not just as a normative project, not just because I want it to be something. It's also because I detect that there is, in all this kind of talk of polarization and fragmentation and is democracy at death's door, I think there is a desire to reassert the common values, the universal values. But what Western democracies have suffered from, particularly in this century, is a lack of self-confidence, a loss of self-confidence. And my argument would be, if I were to advise any president or prime minister, it would be, you have to be self-confident. You have to have a set of values. You believe in them. If you don't believe in them, then what are you doing in office? But you also have to project them with confidence. The difficulty is, and this I think is under-theorized, and I've mentioned it in one or two places before, which is the relationship between democratic confidence and economic progress. When generation on generation, the quality of life and the expectation of living standards is on the up, grievances tend to fall away. As soon as, and we're now in that situation in many, many countries, where for the first time since 1945, the young generation has to come to terms, it's being forced to come to terms with an expectation that its living standards will be lower than those of their parents. This is the first time it's happened in the West since the Second World War. And this breeds grievance, dissatisfaction that something is going wrong. If democracy is about a pluralist approach, an all-inclusive approach, empowering the individual, well, how come the individual has less and less say in what they perceive is no longer, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, you will hear people, younger people saying, well, we're living in an oligarchy, not a democracy. Whether that's true or not depends on each country, each society. But it is this relationship between economic prosperity and political grievance in democracies that I think needs to be theorized, particularly in the context of strategic communications, because if what I'm arguing for is that strategic communication and communicators need to be out there and to put forward their ideas with real confidence, with real self-confidence at a time when their ambitions are being severely undermined by autocratic states who have a vested interest in it. to weaken democracies, then this would be my kind of first point. Speak with self-confidence. I agree with you about FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. I think it is a strategic communications project. Some would argue it is a very ambiguous project. My counter to that would be actually all politics relies on a degree of ambiguity. You cannot have politics without ambiguity because it's not a precise scientific process. It is about conjuring up ambitions, promises, dreams, visions, and they're soft-edged. And we can all participate in the same conversation, but walk away from it with a different picture in our imagination. But in that sense, is there too much ambiguity in FOIP? I don't know. It's too soon to tell. And the whole point, I think, about strategic communications is you have to judge it after decades. I mean, that's its strength, is that if you are in a position to judge it after decades, then it's endured as a particular discourse or discourse theatre. If it's died away, then clearly, for whatever reason, the idea was not strong enough to survive, but that doesn't mean it won't come back again 50 years or 100 years later. Ideas don't die. They become dormant. Difficult. Strategic communications with a capital S, capital C versus strategic communications with small s, small c. I think we still need to preserve that distinction. But I think let's move on to the this dilemma that you've identified. And I think you're right, that it seems that calls for strategic autonomy, and they're not necessarily just in this region. I mean, I think about the European Union, for example, and France in particular, calling for strategic autonomy, by which they mean let's make our own decisions and stand up on our own 2 feet and be strong as the European Union, which is another way of saying let's divest ourselves of overarching influence from the United States or dependence on the United States. Well, good luck. Good luck, is all I can say. These are debates that are going on at the moment, clearly, and I think they will be exacerbated, particularly if Donald Trump becomes the next president of the United States. Then I think calls for strategic autonomy will be severely questioned. We'll see whether Europe can live up to those claims, those ambitions. There are a couple of thoughts that, while you were talking, that I just wanted to bring out that I didn't before. One is that we mustn't fall into the same trap as many politicians do, who love to embrace the idea of FEMI, the foreign malign influence. What concerns me about FEMI is the letter F. And really, I think that's an abrogation of responsibility. That is to blame all your problems on the outside world. This is, we know, this is the way this is the way the state as a body of administration and governance was created historically. But what we face in our times is DMI, domestic malign influence, interference. It's both. Sometimes independent of one another and sometimes conjoined. And we have to study those on a case-by-case basis. But what I don't like is the attitude that it's all about outsiders. It's all about foreigners. It's not. It's about one's own people. The question is, how do you address the grievances of your own people? And in that process, isolate those really hardliners who are intent, for whatever reason, on changing the model of governance or essentially subverting the state for their own purposes. How do you isolate the extremists and bring back into the fold those who are just dissatisfied, who feel disenfranchised, who are unhappy with the situation as it is? So that's one thought. We should talk about FEMI and DMI together. And then more broadly, I'd just like to make the point that, and if I didn't do it successfully before, I'd just like to reiterate this point, which is that the development of strategic communications as a concept and as a body of activity has been driven by actors in the security sector. And the difficulty of that is that those actors will continue to frame the threats and vulnerabilities which they oppose or which they're trying to mitigate in the language of strategic communications. They will say it is about security threats. And those who work in strategic communications, and I'm thinking about both policymakers and media agencies who create the campaigns usually for governments, reinforce that same tight concept of what is really the defense side of strategic communications, defense strategic communications. And the more that becomes the intellectual norm, the more that strategic communications is identified with securitization, the more damaging it becomes, given that strategic communications, I believe its true function is to improve societies, not just in the context of subversion and conflict, but actually across the board, in the economic domain, in the social domain, in health, in welfare. And somehow, I think we're at a point where we need to now start to pull strategic communications as a field of research, scholarly research, political engagement, and intellectual participation among public intellectuals. We need to haul that back. I'm not suggesting that strategic communications has been hijacked by the security sector, but it has certainly become characterized by it and associated with it. We need to get it back, I would say, on course. And you would say to me, you're getting back to normative universal values again, aren't you? And I would say, yes, I am. But as I mentioned just a couple of examples before, that I do feel that we need to address, such as poverty reduction, such as an equitable response to pandemics, introducing fairness between societies, because pandemics don't recognize borders, nor do they recognize social class, ethnicity, or anything else. And solving not mass migration as some topic, but the suffering that mass migration represents. And by mass migration, I mean not just internally displaced or war refugees. That's one type of mass migration. Another is, of course, those, and one thinks about, I come from Europe, so I think very much in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asian, economic migrants, aspirants, just people who want a better life. And what's wrong with that? You know, what is wrong with people wanting a better life? But equally, what is wrong with our trying to create a model of economic engagement and support that is not based on building walls between nation states or laying fields of barbed wire, but actually is based on economic investment in the countries of origin from which those who swell the statistics of mass migration, the countries from which they come. How do we create an economic model? And these are the conversations that we should be trying to have in society, in the world. There are well-trodden paths for that since, as you pointed out, since 1945. They exist, but it's not that we neglect them, but it's as if we have lost confidence in them. And we need to rediscover that confidence and from afresh project those values all over again with the freshness that we had in 1940s. They feel tired, but they shouldn't feel tired. Human suffering and a response whereby one wants to create a better world, a fairer world, and share resources more equally, that should never feel tired.
We seem to be really lacking confidence in the liberal world order that we inherited, at least in the Western part of the world. I think there are a number of reasons for them, and I don't dwell on it. But I think the great majority of those symptoms and also the reasons for a lack of confidence has been actually covered already by Dr. Bolt. So I think strategic communications is our attempt to, I guess you could call that, it's a attempt to scholarly, it's a scholarly attempt partially to try to understand the source of our lack of confidence. How does it relate to, actions of interference of, so-called malign actors, and how best we can respond. But it's not only responding, but I think the crucial thing is, as he elaborately explained, I think our ability to actually imagine a long-term future goal and how to get there. Yes, it should be a proactive long-term project, and we should not be, overtaken by short-term, tactical, I would say, attempt to react to disturbances. So I think Dr. Bolt has been devoting his long career and now his time to actually finally make it a system of theory or a system of approach. So I think, I'm not sure if system is the right term, but I think that I very much commend and appreciate Dr. Bolt's effort in this area. So I would like to thank you for your time, for your lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you both, Professor Bolt and Professor AOI. So that this, I think we can still continue this, discussion, but unfortunately the time is up. So we'll end up here. But this I think it's really important to have this kind of discussion for this is fast moving society, and also today's lecture Professor Bolt actually give us how to consider and how to kind of measure the world right now we are facing. So well, I would like to, again, thank you both professors, and we'll continue this kind of discussion at the Tokyo College. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining the lecture. So maybe we'll see you next time.